Hi friends, let me ask you a question. What do you think Bill Cosby will be remembered for? Will it be his 5 Primetime Emmy Awards, his 8 Grammys, his 2 Golden Globes, maybe his Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2002, or his Humanitarian Award in 2003? Or perhaps the thing that will endure the most will be his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame? Or will it be the fact that Cosby, in later life, faced numerous sexual assault charges, where various women, many women, made claims that he had not only sexually assaulted, but that he had drugged some first as well? I wonder which he'll be remembered for. But let's think about the political realm. In the UK, I wonder what Winston Churchill will be famous for. Will it be the fact that he won the Second World War? What about another politician, John Perfumo? He was the Minister of Defence in the 1960s here. What is he famous for? What does he spring to the mind? Well, certainly if you're in the UK, it was the fact that he had an affair with a prostitute who was also sleeping with a Russian spy. And if we think about American history and American presidents, wonder what will be written in the fullness of time about Theodore Roosevelt. He will probably be remembered for bringing America out of the Depression, and Harry Truman for helping end World War II. Maybe even John Kennedy. He kind of wrote a chapter in history by articulating a vision that one day we should put a man on the moon. And some would credit Ronald Reagan for bringing down the Berlin Wall. But I wonder what Bill Clinton will be remembered for. Now, Clinton, during his presidency, was in charge over a period of unparalleled economic prosperity. But be that as it may, the one thing that may go down in history books and may remain in the mind of most Americans was the fact that he was impeached, and for lying to Congress and lying under oath about an affair he had had when he said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," the woman being Monica Lewinsky. If we think about the Bill Clinton situation, now it was proven beyond any reasonable doubt that it was indeed true. He had had sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky, but he contested it on the basis of his definition of what it meant to have sex. So that brings us to the question, what is the definition of sexual immorality? And who defines it? And what is the biblical definition of sexual immorality? The answer to that question may not be as simple as it seems. For example, the definition of adultery in most countries is what is legally referred to as fornication. But what is the definition Jesus applies here in his Sermon on the Mount? You will remember that Jesus is preaching that our righteousness must exceed this external righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. In fact, I have already pointed out several times that this whole Sermon on the Mount is about righteousness and the 2 different types of righteousness: an external righteousness as personified in the external pontifications and actions of the Pharisees, and an internal righteousness. And Jesus is using this to make that point. And to do that, Jesus uses 6 examples to illustrate the difference between these 2 perspectives. Now, the first of these we looked at in the last couple of episodes, and that was about murder, and how he widened the perspective on what that really meant. And the one we're going to look at today concerns sex and sexual morality. In this passage, Jesus gives us a definition of sexual immorality. So let's turn together to Matthew chapter 5 and let's see what he has to say in this fascinating passage of Scripture. I'm going to do as I often do, which is read the verses from 27 to 30 that we should be looking at over the next couple of days, and then we'll return to them verse by verse and consider and try and unpack them a bit as to what they really mean. So picking up the text in Matthew chapter 5 verse 27, it says this, and remember, this is Jesus speaking. "You have heard it said that you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for the whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body go into hell. So in this passage, Jesus will be seen to discuss two things. Now we're going to look first of all at this view of sexual immorality and lust, but later on, tomorrow, he'll actually discuss adultery and divorce. And after we get done with this passage, I will try and conclude it all and come back at the end and think about what this can teach us and how we can handle sexual immorality or the temptation towards sexual immorality from a biblical point of view. So let's try and get a handle on what the scripture really teaches about how we should handle this very common sin that many people are tempted by, particularly in our modern society. Now we'll get to some of this tomorrow, particularly the stuff about divorce, but let's first of all see what Jesus has to say about what the definition of sexual immorality is. He starts out in verse 27 and he said, "You have heard that it was said," and this is a very important word, "you shall not commit adultery." So again, what Jesus is doing here, he's contrasting what the Pharisees taught in the oral law versus the Old Testament teaching and what it was really meant to point to. So when he says and introduces this passage by saying, "You have heard it was said," it's really important to note that he did not say, "It is written." So he's not dealing exactly with the law of Moses as given on Mount Sinai here. He's dealing and addressing the subsequent interpretation of that law in the oral traditions that followed. So he's talking about what the Pharisees are saying about it, not what Moses himself first wrote down or brought down on the tablets from the mountain. What Moses said was simply, is "Thou shalt not commit adultery." And what the Pharisees said is that was all that was included in that commandment was that particular external physical act. That's all it meant. If you haven't done that physical thing, you hadn't committed that act of physical adultery, then you were okay with God. You'd never committed the sin. But here, in contrast to that, Jesus says, "No, I want to clarify this commandment." And he says, "But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman with lust in his heart has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now, of course, this can equally apply to a female gaze in the inappropriate way upon a man and an inappropriate way of thinking towards a man. Now, this is a pretty difficult statement, so we need to dig into it to see exactly what it means. Does it mean that all you have to do is look and then you've committed adultery? Is that exactly what it's saying? Well, if you look very carefully, he says, "I say to you that whoever looks at a woman..." Now, in the Greek text, the word look is what's called a purpose clause. So the idea here being said is not just that you look, is that you look and the look lands and it stays in the head, and that look, it's a look of intent. It's looking at someone with sexual desire and holding it. The male gaze is sometimes called in art by art critics. Many years ago, an older, mature Christian that I deeply respected was talking to me about this passage, and he summed it up in this way. He says, "The point is to look, and to look in such a way that you say, you know what, I would if I could." It's not necessarily just looking at someone and accepting that they're beautiful. It's not even thinking they may be attractive. It's the intent that lies behind the gaze. As a matter of fact, that's highlighted by the fact that he says he has committed adultery already with her in his heart. There's obviously a outworking of a scenario in the mind, a fantasy, if you like, that that's what they would want to do, and allowing that sexual desire to run its course in the mind of the person. And that's the whole point of this passage. And this is just one illustration. The previous one was about murder and about how that lies in the heart of the person that may subsequently lead to a violent act. And here it's doing the same thing. It's about the motive and allowing the gaze to turn into something of a sexual nature. But there's more to come. But I need to say that the point of this entire passage is that unrighteousness comes always from having an incorrect internal attitude. It's not just the external act of physically committing a sin. Now, I think this verse has given a lot of particularly young men trouble in thinking just because they had a thought pop into their head that they've already committed that act and they're condemned. And that has led some to think, well, if this is happening to me all the time, I can't stop it, so I might as well go ahead and commit the act and enjoy it. But that is a very deceptive logic. Obviously, as it's been said, and the old proverb fits it well, you can't prevent the bird from landing in the tree. In other words, the thought from popping in your head. But you can prevent that bird from building a nest. I think the first person I ever heard say that was Billy Graham. So it's true, the thought may enter your head, but you don't have to build a shrine around it, and that's the point Jesus is making. Then he says this in verse 29. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And then in verse 30 he says the same thing about the hand. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. So this is pretty heavy stuff, isn't it, friends? To pluck out an eye or to cut off a hand. Now, there is an element of hyperbole here, of course, but at the same time, there's no question that Jesus' purpose is teaching in this passage, in this Gospel of Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, is to tell us that sin comes from the heart, and it is a really serious matter. There's no question that this is the whole point of his message. It's the whole point, in fact, of Jesus' ministry. He's making a big issue out of this, and he will again when it comes to chapter 15. This, of course, is highly figurative language in these last two verses, because he's saying if you cut off your right hand, well, you've still got your left. So you know he's obviously using a deliberate hyperbole, overemphasis here, to make the point that this is very significant and a serious thing. That is, if you let sin not just pop into your mind, but if you dwell on it and allow it to go in that direction, you could end up in hell. And it's so radical that he's saying you need to take drastic measures to deal with it. And the picture he paints is one of plucking out an eye and cutting off a hand. I think what he's suggesting here in these two illustrations is that you have a choice between entering heaven with one eye and going to hell with two, and you'd be better off getting into heaven with just the one. His point here is that sex can become, and the wrong approach to sex can become, the thing that hinders you from entering into and deepening your relationship with God. And of course that's really serious. And the point is, he's saying, is at the heart of all of this, not just in this area of sexual sin, but in all areas, it's about the attitude. It's what's going on inside that counts. And you and I, we should do everything we can to prevent our hearts being inflamed by the view of the eye or the attitude of the hand, that it leads to action. And no sacrifice is too great to try and stop that path being followed. I think Paul puts it in really helpful, simple terms in Romans chapter 13, where he says simply, make no provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. In other words, don't go there. Don't make provisions for yourself for it. Don't make provision for those things that tempt and test you. Cut yourself off, even if that means cutting yourself off from those people who influence you badly, but also the places, the books, the magazines, the TV channels, the websites, or anything else that provides the temptation that you might succumb to. Anything that might cause you to sin should be completely cut out of your life. That's clear enough, and that's what he's saying here. Now, up to this point, the Sermon on the Mount has been there to show the gulf that exists between this fake external type of righteousness, which is only interested in us being seen to follow a set of religious rules and regulations, and this internal type of holiness that we are all encouraged to strive for. And that will always begin with our internal attitude. But now, interestingly, at this point, Jesus will bring up of all things divorce and where that fits in, and teach how the teaching on that will help us. Okay, today we're continuing this two-part study in the back end of Matthew chapter 5, looking at the issue and what Jesus has to say about sexual sin. Now, having taught us the true nature of sexual sin, why of all things now does Jesus bring up divorce? Well, this all goes back to the Mosaic law on these matters as described in Deuteronomy chapter 24. In that chapter, along with some other things, it says that if a husband found some, quote, uncleanliness in his wife, he could write out a bill of divorce. Now you can imagine what the scribes and the Pharisees did with that one. The rabbis, they all sat around and tried to figure out what the word uncleanliness meant. And as you can imagine, many points of view came up. One of the main school of thoughts that formed around a rabbi named Shammai said that this only refers to the act of adultery itself. As a matter of fact, one of his followers, writing on this, said, even if a wife is as mischievous as the wife of Ahab, she cannot be divorced except for adultery. Now, another school of thought was formed around the teaching of a rabbi called Hillel, and he took almost the exact opposite point of view. His followers said that a man could divorce his wife if she had so much as spoiled his dinner by putting too much salt in it. Other reasons that were considered acceptable for divorce were if she went in public with her head uncovered, or if she was seen to talk with men in the streets. Also, if at any time she spoke disrespectfully of her husband or his parents, or was perceived to be in the company of troublemakers, or herself was just troublesome or quarrelsome. One rabbi even went so far as to say a man could divorce his wife if she no longer found favour in her sight, which meant that some men felt they could divorce their wife if they found another woman that they considered to be more attractive. So what's critical here, and the reason I go into that, is to understand that Jesus is addressing the subject of sexual sin, divorce, adultery, against that background where the laws of Moses were being misinterpreted, well, actually abused by many Jewish believers and teachers across first century Palestine. People were acting in all sorts of ways to obtain cheap divorces. There was even a situation where a man could divorce his wife by simply writing out that bill of divorce, a divorce statement, and doing it in front of two other men. And then immediately the marriage was over. And that's where Jesus comes along. And look at what he says in the text, picking up at verse 31. And again he uses this phrase. Here we go. You have heard it said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual morality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. What we're really grasping with in this passage is, in one sense, the whole definition of adultery, and from our point of view, that how this word was translated in the New King James Version. Sexual morality was defined as adultery, so we need to talk about that word for a second and what it means. Now, in some of the older translation, rather than the term sexual immorality, it's just translated as fornication. So we need to make a distinction, or see if there is a distinction, between adultery and fornication. There's an old standard definition of all this that says adultery in the Bible is referring to sexual immorality between two married people, well, one strays outside of that. And fornication is a description or the word used for sexual immorality between people who aren't married. But that definition doesn't really float, because there are passages where fornication is used of someone having committed that sin who was married. Although that is the strict meaning of the law, it has a much broader general meaning than just this type of what was considered unlawful sexual activity. You see, it could be between married people, it could be between single people, but it would also include any form of sexual activity that was forbidden in the Old Testament. So Jesus is saying that the exception where divorce is allowed is unlawful sexual activity, which of course includes adultery, which lies outside the marital bed. What people have done with this verse historically is really very interesting. Catholic churches take this verse and they've concluded that there should be no remarriage permitted in any circumstances except the death of a married partner. In the Protestant churches, however, and the Orthodox churches, most have concluded that there are two grounds for divorce in the Bible. One is this sexual immorality, as described here, based on this passage, but also some teaching from Matthew 19, where the desertion of an unsaved partner is added, allowing the divorce then to be permitted if the unsaved person who has deserted the Christian initiates and seeks that divorce. And that remains the historic position of most Eastern Orthodox churches and the Protestant churches in the West, that these are the only two grounds on which divorce is allowed. Now, it isn't way beyond my scope today, and it's not my intent to go into all the ramifications of divorce and how it affects Christian churches. And the truth of the matter is, particularly in the West, Christian churches have plenty of divorced people in them. But I do think I have to say one little thing and speak to this very basic issue. And that is, divorce is something that always hurts people. Everyone who has been through a divorce will tell you that people suffer, and probably the people who suffer the most are the children. In the Old Testament, it says God hates divorce, but God also forgives it. So let's be clear, it's not the unforgivable sin or the unpardonable sin, as there are some people on the margins of Christianity say, but we do need to recognize that although this sin is forgivable, the standards for potential forgiveness by God are very high, and that we ought not to negate or change those standards. We can't lower the standard just to fit our culture or our society. You see, God hates divorce, and because of that, God has put the standard extremely high. And I want to speak to that for a minute, and irrespective of your own personal experience or the country in you live, but we've got to understand that God has made the standard for marriage high, and thereby the standard by which we can dissolve a marriage high as well. And he did it specifically for the reason because he wants to protect marriage. I think he wants to protect marriage because God knows, and we should recognize also, that it's the foundation of any society. And if you destroy or undermine marriage, then the society around it will begin to crumble. Society begins at home. Well, it begins in the heart, but then it continues in the home. And because I really do believe that, that's why I'm a minister, I'm a preacher, I'm not a politician. I believe that's the most effective way to change society, is to change people's hearts and people's lives and people's motivations, and thereby the society, the immediate society around them, and maybe even the wider society, will be impacted by that. Now, I'm not opposed to people being politicians, and politicians can do some good things, but they can't ultimately solve the core problem, and that is the deterioration of our society, because it lies in the heart of individual people as they individually turn away from God. And it's in the home where it is first seen and impacted. The Romans, they built their early society on the family. Very early on, after the initial establishment of Rome, marriage was seen as a lifelong partnership, and prostitution was actually held with pretty much contempt in the Roman Empire for the first roughly 500 years of its existence. Do you know that for the first 500 years of the Roman Empire, there was not a single case of divorce? It just wasn't allowed and sought. What happened next is, you see, the Romans, as they spread out and their empire spread, they conquered other empires, other nations, but they particularly conquered the Greeks militarily. Although the Romans conquered the Greeks militarily, they would say the Greeks conquered the Romans morally. And divorce gradually spread and became a common practice among the Romans as it had been among the Greeks. Within just a few generations, they went from not having a single divorce for 500 years to one ancient Roman author writing that he knew of a woman who had had 8 husbands in 5 years. That sounds like more modern-day Hollywood than it does ancient Rome, doesn't it? Their attitude towards marriage and divorce became so cynical that another well-known Roman author wrote, "Marriage brings only 2 happy days, the day when the husband first marries his wife and clasps her to his breast, and the day he lays her in the tomb." How far they had fallen. The situation became so bad in the empire that special taxes were put against the unmarried to try and encourage people to marry and stay married, and single people were prohibited from receiving an inheritance. So the point is, God, I believe, has set a very high standard, but some of us, of course, miss that standard. But that doesn't mean that you begin to tamper and unpick the standard. The standard is the thing that protects you. It protects your home. It protects children. And ultimately, it protects the whole society. And I believe even the history of Greece and Rome illustrate that. All right, let me try and sum up this first part of what I'm saying and also make some suggestions. What Jesus is teaching in this passage is that before God, spiritual adultery is not just the physical act, but it's an intentional, coveting attitude towards someone with whom you are not married. And except for this type of sexual immorality, remarriage after divorce is considered an act of adultery. The standard is very high, but the real issue in this passage, throughout not just these verses, but the whole of Jesus' sermon, is that righteousness, real righteousness, is an internal heart attitude, not an external act. It begins in the heart and it works outward from there. When I talked about Bill Clinton in the introduction, I'm kind of suggesting that he did what the Pharisees did. He twisted a definition of what sexual relationships were, and he tried to claim that he wasn't lying because he defined sex purely as sexual intercourse. But that clashes with this passage, and clearly it's simply wrong. Now, I don't think that Jesus is teaching, although he widens the perspective to include the temptations and the lusts in the heart, I don't think he's teaching that that is as bad as the act, but he is definitely saying they're both sins, and they're both serious sins, and that's the point he's trying to make. Now, if you think I'm wrong about this and what I've said about Bill Clinton's view of it, then I just suggest that you ask any married woman if she thinks Bill Clinton's definition of adultery was correct, and that what he did was not an act of adultery. Enough said. So having brought up the subject of sexual immorality and how we should respond to the temptation towards it, the question we're asking here, and hopefully dragging some solutions out of this, is what does the Bible teach us? What can it do to help us avoid not only temptation to the act, but also sexual immorality generally? So I'm not just talking about the external act, I'm talking about how can we change our internal attitude towards these things. You know, if this is as serious as Jesus says it is, then we really need to know how to deal with this. So I'm going to draw, I believe, 3 suggestions, 3 concluding points that I think I can take from this passage and others. Here's number 1. If you want a biblical solution to sexual temptation and immorality, are you ready for this? Number 1 solution, according to the New Testament, is marriage. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul teaches it is better to marry than to burn with sexual lust. And he also commends sexual activity within the bounds of Christian marriage. Now, if you've never read that chapter before, read it. You might be surprised at just what a positive spin Paul puts on the idea of consensual sexual relationships between a married couple. It certainly flies in the face of those who teach that there's fundamentally something wrong in sex. Not at all, if you read this passage and see how Paul approaches it. So the bottom line is, Paul's saying if you've got a problem, then one solution might be to get married, to the right person, of course, because that will then solve most of your problems and temptation. Granted, it's not going to solve all the problems, but God's solution for the problem of wanton sexual temptation, his number one response is, well, it begins with getting married. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute you go out and propose to the first woman or man you see. That's not the idea I'm suggesting here. But you do get the point, don't you? Number 2, let me give you another biblical solution to solving sexual immorality. And here it is, as a matter of fact, let me just read 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, which tells us, flee from sexual immorality. And then it adds, all other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. And then just as an add-on, 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 22 says, flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace, along with those who called on the Lord out of a pure heart. So flee from it. Get out of there. This is the strongest possible language this is recommending. Remember, Jesus said, if your eye offends, you pluck it out. If your hand offends, you cut it off. Get out of there, it's saying. Don't look at that website. Flee from it. Don't put yourself in those situations, in those places where you will be tempted. And if you can't show self-control, well, it could mean trashing the computer or cancelling the membership to the club you go to. Now, does that sound radical? Well, I believe that is absolutely the practical 21st century ramifications of plucking your eye out and cutting off your hand. It could mean pulling the cable out of your computer and throwing it in the skip. So stop it. Is that clear enough advice for you? I mean, Jesus was pretty strong about this and what he talked about, the eye and the hand, didn't he? But don't think that this is just for guys. The same as advice is there for women as well. Just don't go there. I know this is a harsh word, but I'm giving you biblical solutions today, not psychological excuses for succumbing to temptations. Now, I know what some psychologists teach about these things. I've studied these things in some detail. I've taken courses, and I've also taught on aspects of mental illness and addiction from a biblical point of view. And I'm just telling you that biblically, Jesus is telling us to cut it out, to cut it off. Whatever it is that's leading you astray, cut it off completely. And finally, I have a third suggestion. And while all that I've just said is true, there is a third thing that needs to be said. What I've said so far in talking about solutions to the problem of the temptation to commit sexual sin, we've talked about getting married and expressing your sexual desires within the married relationship and staying in that married relationship. And then Jesus has talked about fleeing from sexual temptation, those things that appear outside of marriage, and cut them out. But then Jesus does something else in this passage, and I think it is actually the heart of the issue. And the heart of the issue has been covered by the whole Sermon on the Mount up to this point, because it says the heart of this issue, as is with others, is the very heart of humanity itself. If you were to look at the Sermon on the Mount and just study it in its entirety in one go, the natural thing that you would conclude at the end is that this is what Jesus is teaching. The problem is with the heart of humanity. If you think about it and what we've looked at so far, when Jesus taught, he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Maybe you remember us discussing that a few weeks ago, and remember what I said. Jesus was talking about getting to a place and being in a place where you recognize you can't do anything for yourself, by yourself. That phrase about blessed be the poor in spirit means about reaching a place where you recognize your need of an utter dependence on God to do anything. Then take the next one, blessing are those who are mourn. You know, the very reason most people succumb to temptation and engage in sexual immorality is simply because they want to. They do it because they think for the moment that it will give them pleasure. And that's why they get into the pig pen and roll around in the mud. And then when they realize afterwards they're dirty, they've got dirty, the call of Jesus is we need to return to the Father and get to a point where we mourn for those things that we've done wrong, not just in this area, but in all areas of our life. Grieving, it talks about, knowing that what we have done has offended the Father, hasn't met his standard. So you see, the internal attitude is the thing that's really critical here. But then he talked about those who hunger and thirst after righteousness and how they shall be filled. Now hear me and hear me well. From a biblical point of view, this is the answer to not only the problem of the temptation to succumb to sexual immorality, but to succumb to anything in your life that fails to meet the standard of God. But in this case, we're talking about instead of being filled with the lust of the flesh, you replace it with a deep mourning of your personal sin and a hunger and thirst after righteousness and dependence on God. So it's replacing one thing with another thing, replacing a bad thing, a wrong thing, with a good thing. So I'm going to conclude with that third thing and tell you to go and replace the lust of the eye with a hunger and a thirst after the righteousness of God. As a matter of fact, I mentioned a moment ago that 2 Timothy 2 says, flee from it. But listen to what the whole verse says. It says, flee the evil desires of your youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace, etc. So, if you want to understand what Scripture is teaching here in this regard, it's teaching us that the problem is in the heart and everything else spills out of that. And in order to solve that problem, you need to replace the lust of the flesh, the lust for sin, with the love for the Lord. Now you may struggle with that, especially if it's a habit that's entrenched, and it may take some time. And all of that, in some way, I believe is understood and accepted by the Lord. But as long as you begin to make the effort, then ultimately you will find that this biblical solution will allow God to come in and meet you in grace and have victory over it. You see, the danger of having an undisciplined thought life is it produces an immoral physical life. If we fill our minds with filthy thoughts, we will eventually live filthy lives. So abort that thought before it is birthed. Nip it in the bud. When you're feeling temptation, replace the drive to act it out with the drive to seek righteousness, primarily, I would say, through prayer and getting your nose into the book, the Bible, and say to the Lord and pray to the Lord and say, Lord, I need help. I'm grieving for the direction I'm being drawn in. I need your Spirit. I need you to come into me, Lord, and give me a hunger and thirst after righteousness instead of this other way of thinking and living. You've got to replace one way of thinking with another. How do you stop thinking about one thing? It's really simple. This is the way we've been created, simply by thinking about something else. If you want to stop thinking about something A, then just start focusing on B. So how do you solve the problem of dwelling on sin? Replace it by dwelling on something else. And that, friends, is the Word and the presence of God. There's no doubt in my mind that's what the Scripture teaches, and there's no doubt in my mind that that is the thing, the only thing that really works. So nip it in the bud. Quit thinking about it and replace those thought processes with thinking and dwelling upon the Lord. Thereby you can replace the lust of the flesh, all the lusts of this world, with a love for God and a love for the Lord. And Jesus is saying here, not only can you do that, yes you can, but he will help you do that and achieve that.